Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night to you lovely folks joining me here nice and early at Marvel's Snap Zone. Welcome back for yet another weekly tier list update. We've got some movers and shakers this week, some tech choices increasing in popularity, and a number of, sadly, old favourite decks falling off the tier list for the first time ever, just because of lack of play or popularity or performance all around. So some interesting things to keep our eyes on this week. Very much looking forward to sharing it with you. If you want to see us playing these decks, we actually had our very first live stream here over on YouTube yesterday night. It was a lot of fun. We intend on doing it up to 3 days a week currently if the reception remains as good as it was, with the intention of going live once again at 6 PM GMT tomorrow to play some more decks from this tier list, play some maybe fan favourite suggestions, and just have a good time all around. So feel free to check out the VOD that's already on YouTube if you want to see what that was like, or come and join us tomorrow for more experience with these decks. However, this week's list is going to be going on screen for you now. So if all you want is to see the changes from last week, you now can. If you just want to see where stuff has landed this week, you can do that right now as well. But I'm going to be taking a breakdown of this in just a second, and then time-stamping each and every deck from tier 1 to 3 to talk about them all with you in just a few moments. As I say, if you haven't subscribed already, would very much appreciate it. We are doing our best to keep growing over here at Marvel Snap Zone, having a great time doing it. So turn that thumb on, turn the notifications on, and help us out in doing exactly that. Would be much appreciated. So we had a bit of a crazy first week of ladder play last week. Lots of brand new decks. So in comparison, this week has felt much quieter. Unfortunately, it doesn't have anywhere near as much novelty to feature, I should say. Instead, we're mostly mourning the loss of a few archetypes. It's a real shame to say this, but slowly but surely, some archetypes are falling down the popularity ladder. You can still find decks like Zero and Mr. Negative in our tier 4, which ranks decks that are, either underperforming or not seeing enough play for us to trust the data we have on them, but they have mostly fallen out of favour in this current metagame. Even if the decks remain the same mostly this week, the power rankings of the top dogs has changed quite a bit, and flexibility seems to be the name of the game this week. Indeed, Cosmo becoming a staple in more and more decks alongside Armor, which means the on-reveal and discard decks are just suffering just a bit from not being able to play as freely as they previously wished. Also, we can see some archetypes that were previously under the radar starting to adapt to popular tech cards. For example, Patriot is now migrating towards a more combo-orientated build with Sera as a way to disguise its key cards from timely copies of Enchantress, ruining their game. Overall, this week felt like the community was looking to refine and adapt to big changes that happened at the start of the Warriors of Wakanda season. So creativity might be down a notch, but there is still more important information to see here and collect from all of this, and we're very excited to share with you. As always, we want to quote a few sources for data before we get started on the tier list this week. MarvelSnap.pro working on our brand new tracker with us, which we're looking to release very, very soon. They've been great at helping us collect data while we play games, and also collect data from many other parties as well. Well worth checking them out if you haven't done so already. SnapFan and their respective community Discord server doing a great job at providing win rates for decks, cube averages for decks, etc, etc, and we very much appreciate their input on this tier list as well. Snapdecks over on Twitter, guilty of retweeting all of your best community decks that showcase some of the cool stuff going on out there around the world, so thank you to them for their data as well. Marvel Snap IO, very similar deal, once again providing some great data for this tier list, and last but not least, all the players out there, yourselves included, who have taken the time to discuss your insight and your play patterns with us to help inform our choices with this tier list. So, let's break it down, talk about what's moved where, and then we'll go into each individual deck and walk you through the thought process of it this week. So, tier 1 remains exactly the same, but some things have moved up and down in tier 1 in terms of popularity and being the quote-unquote best decks in the tier. So we believe Baero remains the best deck in Marvel Snap right now. It's definitely by a razor-thin margin, but it holds on to that title for another week. Ongoing and Destroyer and Sera Miracle both having stronger weeks than before, making themselves higher commodity over things like Wong Reveal and Dracula Lockjaw, which finds itself moving down to the bottom of Tier 1 this week. Sera Miracle's actually evolved quite a bit this week, with a lot of very interesting changes in the list we chose to feature that we also played on stream last night and found was a blast, so stay tuned for that one. That one's very, very sweet. Down in Tier 2 this week, we got a couple of decks moving their way up to the top of Tier 2 in the form of Control, which is a welcome sight for many, and the Deathpool deck, mostly I imagine off the back of Death's Domain being a featured location at the end of this week. Kazoo, unfortunately, falling down the tier just a bit, but still holding on to a Tier 2 berth. Patriot finding itself still firmly at the bottom of Tier 2 this week as well. Tier 3, fans rejoice. Movement making some waves this week, continuing to evolve and find new toys to make that deck function, and as a result finds itself at the top of tier number 3. Location finds itself in Tier 3 once again this week, much like Hela Discard. However, the Lockjaw OnReveal deck, not the best deck in Tier 3 anymore, falling down ever so slightly, and Zero falling down into tier number 4 alongside Mr. Negative. Joined this week, however, brand new deck in Tier 4 in Cerebro 2, which if you're interested in seeing some gameplay of that one and how that one works, we uploaded a deck feature onto the channel just a few days ago. Go and check that out. Have a good time at watching some gameplay of that deck and seeing how it works. As always, other Tier 4 options kept down there, much like Bounce and Hand Size Panther, and some budget options down there for you Pool 2 players as well. So with that all said and done, let us hop on over into the client and start walking through some of these deck lists. Alrighty, so starting things off with the mighty Baero. Brand new sub appearing on screen as we're mid-video. Might have to get used to turning that off, actually. We'll have to wait and see how that goes. Yeah, so okay, Baero once again remaining kind of the top deck of our tier list, but again, by a very thin margin, definitely not an overwhelming metagame share. The reason for this is a large part of the metagame is hating on the deck. Armor and Cosmo, both toys that you don't want to see when you're playing a deck like this, but however, it's still finding a way to perform and still racking up an exceptionally high cube average given that information. Compared to Deathpool, for example, which is another deck suffering at the hands of some of the most popular tech cards at the moment, Baero feels like it's more versatile and able to adapt. Lastly, Aero and Magneto on turn 5 and turn 6 are still just, you know, a really good duo of plays regardless of everything else if all you're looking to do is annoy your opponent. And when they're sometimes joined by Death thanks to Wave, it allows for the two strongest options in the late game, Disruption and an ability to put tons of points on the board at the same time. If you're not familiar with this one somehow, this deck can very much be split into two parts. Set up the late game, reap the rewards of doing so. Your early game is built around doing two things. Get ahead in lane, get 2 kills off so you can discount Death by 2. It's going to allow you to then play it alongside another card on turn 6 thanks to the powerful on-reveal ability of Wave, which will make things cost 4, but the reduction of Death will then apply on top of this and make it cost 2, allowing you to play 2 cards. There are several efficient ways of doing this. You can Carnage plus Bucky Barnes to create an efficient threat in the process. Mysterio can leave behind tokens that can be killed off by Carnage or Deathlock. Or Hood, Nova, these are cards that can die to Killmonger, Deathlock or Carnage to also leave some power behind in the process. Often when you've achieved this, you just want to be slamming Wave on turn 5, setting up Death plus another card on turn 6, and preventing the opponent from doing too much on their turn 6. So Death is going to lock up a lane you play her into, and Magneto or Aero can pull cards out of the other location that you are already ahead on to keep it safe. And because Wave limits how many cards the opponent can play on turn 6, Aero and Magneto rarely have the problem of being played into a lane that could already be filled, which allows for some exceptional endgame turns with this deck, and it's the reason for the most part that we believe it is still the best deck in Marvel Snap. If you're looking for a full guide to this one and how it works, we have it on the website. Go check out the article in the description below, written by our very own KM Best. Go check out their work and see if you can enjoy the Baero deck for yourself. Okay, so coming up next, Ongoing Destroyer, once again remaining an absolute linchpin of Marvel Snap right now. It is pretty great. When it comes to pure potential, in terms of points, we have a hard time ranking this deck in Tier 1. The fact is, it can naturally run 2 of the strongest cards in the metagame currently, in the form of Armor and Cosmo, which allows it to fight every other Tier 1 deck and lower their potential enough to often beat them without having to make adjustments to play against them. Compared to other disruptive decks, Ongoing Destroyer has a much higher points output, which separates it from traditional control decks in that vein. We suspect that it hits the right balance between trying to be reactive and develop a high enough score to win, which is what's leading to a large amount of its success right now. The deck aims to fill the board with ongoing cards while trying to limit what the opponent can do. As such, the deck is split into two separate parts once again: ongoing cards, reactive cards. The proactive part, you'll find things like Ant-Man, Colossus, Mojo, Captain America, Mr. Fantastic, and Warpath. These are cards that will be your main source of points during the first part of the game. Keep in mind though that you are running Warpath, so you really don't want to expand onto all three locations if you can help it. This list is not playing the goblins like previous versions. As for the reactive parts, Armor, Cosmo, Professor X all fill these roles. These should let you set up a good destroyer and hopefully protect Lizard while annoying Destroyer on reveal in the process. And because Spectrum can also buff things on turn 6, things like Professor X can actually contribute to the point score very, very well, and sometimes steal locations your opponent can no longer play into. Remains a great one, and again, if you're looking for a detailed origin story / guide written by the creator of this deck, Owen Collier-Ridge, you can also find that in this week's tier list article down below. Go check it out. Up next, Sera Miracle. Really excited to talk about this one, actually, because this deck has evolved yet again, and I can't believe I'm saying this, because, like, every week, the Sera Miracle aficionados just seem to generate a new list that throws me off guard and surprises me with its overall power and potential. While I would rank Discard or Wong Reveal higher than this deck if Cosmo wasn't so popular, Sera Miracle gets the nod ahead of that because it's a much harder deck to counter with those cards. As a result, although the deck has a higher ceiling, which, you know, finally, although a deck with a higher ceiling emerged last week in the form of Wong Reveal, Sera Miracle still manages to be a top contender because it mixes flexibility with a high scoring point total. As you may have guessed, the power of this deck is based on Sera, but I want to talk about the updates to this deck this week in the form of this little Brood package. So if you aren't familiar with Brood, it will create 2 Broodlings for you at the same location with the same power as itself. Mr. Sinister, a similar effect, creating a clone of itself with the same power. Now, this version of the deck is able to add additional stats to these cards, courtesy of Forge, which will give the next card you play +2, or Okoye, which will give every card in your deck +1. This means that final turn of the game burst with Sera can actually provide you with several bodies with much, much larger stats than expected. If you're really lucky, you can sometimes just put 15 points into a single location with a 2-cost Brood on the final turn of the game, thanks to all of these buffs. So you see a normal chunk of toys you see in this deck that are normally played in Sera Miracle. You still have access to Angela, Mysterio, these high point scoring cards, even Rescue in this version as well. But we still have access to the Killmonger Nova package as well on the final turn of the game. But the middling part of the deck, your usual like Mojos and other Bishops, other high scoring point cards, replaced by these multiple bodies that fill more areas that can pick up these buffs from a Okoye and Forge exceptionally well. I think this is a really sweet update. I had a great time playing it last night and highly recommend checking it out if you haven't done so already. This deck is shining at the moment because of its flexibility on turn 6, and you should have information on where you can and cannot play your Destroy and or on reveal effects by the time you get to that point in the game. Also, if your opponent has priority on turn 6, you're safe from Shang-Chi or Enchantress ruining your party, which right now is a really big deal. Once again, if you're looking for a complete guide on Sera Miracle, there is one of those in the article as well. Go check it out. Up next, Wong Reveal, once again a tier 1 deck this week. No changes to report in this archetype. Looks basically the same as it did last week, just falling down a peg due to some big problems in the metagame in the forms of reliability and the existence of Cosmo. That being said, Wong Reveal is still easily the highest point scoring deck in the game currently. When you have your godly hands of Wong, Black Panther and Arnim Zola, you create some absolutely ridiculous end boards, but sadly they do not guarantee you wins in spots where Cosmo exists in so many decks, and he can be played on Wong's location as an answer to that god draw. As a result, you're pressed to play more conservatively and not snap as soon as you would do otherwise when you have all your good stuff in hand, which is leading to fewer large cube wins and definitely more huge punishes when you get it wrong. You're mostly looking to abuse Wong and Odin in this on-reveal shell here. This deck really separates the first 3 and last 3 turns of the game. Once Wong is in play, we enter a completely different realm of potential power. The basic sequence for this deck is going to be Wong on 4, player 5 behind it, player 6 behind that. Ideally, it's going to be Black Panther into Arnim Zola or White Tiger into Odin. Dr. Doom is going to be a bit of a fit everywhere card to replace one of those missing pieces if required. Ironheart and Wolfsbane can also represent a very powerful turn 6 in a pinch. Really powerful endgame turns with this deck. Unfortunately, just really soft to the cosmos of the meta game right now. Lockjaw Dracula remains one of my favourite decks in Marvel Snap right now, but it's having a bad week and mostly not really being ranked as one of the better decks in Tier 1 right now, off the back of the fact that, well, how do I put this politely? It has the same problem again as like Wong Reveal. It's a deck with a capacity to generate chunks of points, but it has the same kind of weaknesses. And discard arguably has more of an inability to adapt to location variants or disrupt the opponent's game plan, making it quite easy to counter if your opponent's draw lines up particularly well. As a result, the more popular like Lockjaw Dracula becomes, the worse it theoretically gets. It's like the perfect niche deck, rising to punish decks that didn't include enough disruption or thought they would win a point-focused battle against big Morbiuses and Draculas, but also one that can't be played into an environment that has so much hate or has any particularly detrimental featured location. The deck is looking to use Lockjaw to maximize your discard effects. When you start going off, your hand should melt really quickly. This means it's important to find either Swarm or Apocalypse before doing so, hence the inclusion of America Chavez in this deck to increase that consistency. When you do, Swarm will give you potential explosive plays alongside Lockjaw later on, and Apocalypse can grow to stupidly large amounts of power, making Dracula win a lane all by itself. Between Morbius, Lockjaw and Dracula, you are entirely possible you can start discarding on turn 5 and don't need to discard any earlier, not risking losing any of those cards. That isn't much of a problem thanks to, you know, not losing locations thanks to Swarm being able to catch you back up and fill them later on, especially alongside Lockjaw's ability to spew some extra discards into that game plan. The deck is still very sweet and still very strong, remains itself a tier 1 strategy in this current environment, but definitely falling to the bottom of tier 1 due to how much it is struggling into location variants and the amount of hate in the form of Cosmo. Moving ourselves into tier 2, one of the top contenders of tier 2 this week, Control, an archetype many people are happy to see having a level of success that it wasn't previously. What can I say about this one? As every single archetype becomes more refined, the ways you need to disrupt their game plan also become easier to figure out. This week, the Control build seemingly performing the best was a pile of super annoying cards more than anything particularly synergistic. As soon as one of them lands a huge blow on the opponent, snap if you want to force them to retreat, or if you're a little more daring, you can snap the turn before and just crush your opponent's dreams, which is kind of great. This one has less reactive cards than normal, although Cosmo and even some versions of like Dr. Octopus can make the cut in this list if you're looking for alternative endgame pieces over, say, something like Captain Marvel. The deck really wants to develop some points before switching to its reactive game plan. Being able to get ahead in one location makes playing to a second one with reactive cards much easier. Through Angela and the basic destroy cards you see in this list here, you're going to be able to contest the location early a lot of the time, and then you'll win a second one by relying on your flexible cards, things like Captain Marvel or Dr. Doom, into a stormed location, or wait for your opponent to commit to a location and punish them with Enchantress or Shang-Chi. A really powerful strategy, and again, becoming more and more refined as the metagame refines around it. Deathpool finds itself in tier 2 this week as well. Definitely still a strong option, but having, again, the same problem as a lot of decks this week, suffering into a large uptick of armor and Cosmo, which limits the major synergies this deck has available to it. It seems like it isn't the best time to be playing these decks, but it is still finding a way to remain relevant despite these counter cards. Death's Domain was obviously the hot location on Sunday as well. Deathpool saw a surge in play rate, but it actually didn't become a huge juggernaut like one would expect when your best location is in half of your games, which is definitely a concerning stat for a deck like this. It's based around trying to destroy Deathpool as many times as you possibly can, including reducing death's cost in the process while you do that. Then you can copy Deathpool's power with Taskmaster and play it alongside Death thanks to Wave's ability on the final turn of the game. This deck also has the nice upside of naturally playing around most board disruption cards like the Goblins or the Rocks, thanks to how easy it is for you to destroy things. Outside of your 4 main cards, the rest of the deck is definitely just destroying cards, making Deathpool grow in the form of Carnage, Venom, or even things like Hulkbuster to really juice it up real quick. Either that, or they get benefits from being destroyed themselves in the form of Bucky Barnes, Nova, or the Hood. Definitely a deck to keep your eye on, but not the strongest contender in Pool 2 this week. Kazoo finding itself firmly in Pool 2, but falling down just a little bit this week. We ranked it as a great deck last week, praising it for its ability to rank up quite fast and offer a steady play pattern from one game to another. This week is looking a little bit different, with Discard and Wong Reveal being more popular initially and then being pushed down, but both of those decks this week mainly causing issues for Kazoo because they are beating it in a point scoring contest. So when you aren't necessarily disrupting as you might need to, it struggles to compete with those decks. As a result, you see most of these Kazoo lists adapting those hate cards, getting them in the deck itself in the form of Armor and Cosmo once again. This deck still feels quite good and benefits from those 2 cards being so popular because neither of them do anything to annoy you in any real way. This is the textbook proactive deck. You should all be familiar with Kazoo at this point. Develop points, make smart use of your energy. Your first 3 turns are super flexible. You're going to be looking to go Kazaa into Blue Marvel, into Iron Man or Chavez on those final turns of the game to really push home your final bursts of damage. The current builds, as we say, include Armor and Cosmo to protect its 1-drop cards from Killmonger and also annoy those super popular strategies right now. Ideally, you want to play Armor onto a location where you're also going to play Ant-Man and another 1-cost card in order to keep them safe from Killmonger, where Cosmo is definitely more flexible to play and preferred alongside your big ongoing cards to protect them from Enchantress. Patriot, once again, a Pool 2 deck this week, also adjusting ever so slightly in this current metagame. Its older form was difficult to use because Enchantress was so popular. As a result, aficionados have decided to take their deck in another direction and use Sera to hold your key cards for a little bit longer. Now, Patriot acts as more of a combo piece. It's looking to disguise its most important cards for as long as it possibly can, so they aren't vulnerable to opposing counters. While this change didn't make Patriot soar to the top of our tier list, it definitely feels like it's currently suited better for the existing metagame over some of the other versions of this deck that include cards like Ultron. At this point, you should be pretty familiar with Patriot as well. It revolves around making the most of your payoff cards that buff your entire board. These are things like Kazaa, things like Blue Marvel that do a good job at replacing Patriot in a pinch if required. Kazaa obviously much better in the versions that contain Onslaught in the final turns of the game. Your big go-to ideally includes things like Mystique and Patriot, or being able to play late game Onslaughts to double up all of those effects. You'll also find several versions of this deck playing things like Magic or Adam Warlock to secure you extra draw steps and make sure you have the ability to play all of your combo pieces out. The rest of the deck is filled with cheap recipients for buffs and should be used to fill 2 locations while you focus on your combo in the last few turns, using that 3rd location for all your payoffs. Again, Ultron an option for a deck like this to have a different path to victory, but definitely doesn't fit into this snug shell with Sera, which is why it doesn't make the cut in this list here. Bottom of tier 2 this week, but definitely still holding its own in the form of Patriot. One that I'm more excited about, Move. You guys keep asking about this deck and how we feel about it, and I'll tell you what, it's improving and it's putting up a fight as people are refining how this archetype is supposed to play. It is looking brighter for the Move archetype, but it still feels a little early to push this up to tier 2 and call the comeback complete. That said, it's undeniable that the cards that move your opponent's cards have been a helpful addition to this deck. In addition to making it easier to grow your copies of Kraven and Dagger, it also helps the deck with being more unpredictable and having different play patterns in their last turns other than just slamming Heimdall and hoping for the best. The move archetype is based on several key cards, supported by the rest of the deck. In this iteration, the cards you're looking to move are Human Torch, Dagger, and we support that with Vulture and Craven as cards that we want to grow all around. Human Torch and Vulture just want to move as much as they possibly can, as they grow to ridiculous points totals the more you move them. This is enabled by things like Iron Fist, Cloak, Doctor Strange, or Heimdall. They should always be valuable cards as long as they're paired with one of these two. Dagger and Craven require a little bit more finesse and seem to be more situational. Yet thanks to the newly introduced package of Polaris, Baero, and Magneto, we're able to set them up way more efficiently. Lastly, this feels like kind of the biggest improvement compared to the previous move builds, we have more ways of developing raw stats. Miles Morales, Baero, and Magneto all contribute exceptionally nicely in this way. Very happy to see this deck having a successful week, and hopefully it continues to do so. Location finds itself once again in Tier 3, the other archetype that is looking to disrupt your opponent's fun more than poor control. It's posting solid results, but nothing to write home about this week. The key to Location is that it isn't running big swing cards like Enchantress or Shang-Chi. Instead, the build focuses more on cards that make sense together and looks to be a more cohesive game plan rather than having a big one-off ridiculous swing turn. That tends to be how that plays over the alternative instead. As a result, currently, it seems like the swingy approach is earning more cubes, which makes sense when you think about it. And the top decks are being heavily targeted, meaning Location might resist the metagame shift better than Control will. We'll have to wait and see how it adjusts going forward. But again, this deck very much thriving off that key 1-2 punch of Armor and Cosmo right now. You're looking to limit the playing field for your opponent, make it easy for us to guess their next play where they have to go, as they have no other options. With Storm, Spider-Man, Hobgoblin, Professor X, these kind of cards in multiple versions of this list, you're going to be able to reduce the game to 1 or 2 locations, which make Armor and Cosmo even more crippling for your opponent. This also gives you, high point cards in this list to have game into spots like that. Ebony Maw, Lizard, Jessica Jones, much higher chance of winning a location with those cards when you're locking off your opponent's ability to play into them. Lists like this also use cards like Nightcrawler and Doctor Doom to support those cards, as they give you the ability to impact otherwise unplayable locations. Location's still a very sweet deck, and unfortunately not quite the preferred control variant this week. Hela Discard finding itself once again in Tier 3 this week. It's first on the long list of decks you're about to see that almost instantly lose to Cosmo being played somewhere you really don't want to see it. Still, the surprise factor of this deck yields to a quite nice result, and it has huge unpredictability over other archetypes just because of the insane value of a high roll in the final turns of the game. Hela is also a deck that's able to play pretty patiently compared to other decks on this list. It could appear to an opponent as a Dracula deck for the first few turns, baiting your opponent into thinking that they have you figured out as you pull out a win with Hela at the end. The deck revolves around using Invisible Woman to safely play your discard effects and Hela onto that location. At the end of the game, all those effects will trigger in order and summon back everything that you discard. However, when you don't draw Invisible Woman, you can just play for points on turn 3, turn 4, turn 5, and turn 6, as the deck has many high score cards, or you can risk it, get discarding, and hope that you don't discard or draw Hela before turn 6. Jubilee has been a consideration in decks like this in the past, providing another solid turn 4 play in the deck. Red Skull also sometimes included as well, providing a second 5-cost card if Captain Marvel is not enough for you in your opinion. Hela Discard, kind of a known archetype at this point, definitely one that's suffering in the face of the provident hate cards of the format right now. Last but not least, in Tier 3, Lockjaw OnReveal, another really quiet week for this deck. Unlike Zero or Negative Serotonin, the deck is still seeing a decent amount of play on the ladder, although Cosmo does still shut you down pretty hard. The archetype seems to have lost both reasons to play it currently, because the Wong deck that is superior is going to be, Wong OnReveal. That's a better OnReveal deck than Lockjaw. And the discard Lockjaw deck seems to be a better Lockjaw deck than this deck, unfortunately. Plan A is super straightforward for this. You're looking to abuse Lockjaw with cheap cards in order to get bigger ones. Plan A, pretty simple there. Plan B, abuse on-reveal synergies as best you can, and try and compete when you don't draw Lockjaw. Through Thor, Jubilee, White Tiger, Odin, you can still have a very decent amount of points while playing on curve, and that'll give you a fighting chance instead of having to immediately retreat if you don't draw Lockjaw. The deck is definitely weaker there, but you can find some play patterns to compete. So compared to the start of the season, this week felt a bit empty. We were obviously 16 changes last week, not so much craziness to showcase this time around, but these kind of times are also very important in a metagame. They represent a stabilization period and can set up the next big moves to take advantage of these new stable cards. Apparently Wong Reveal and Discard aren't so difficult to keep in check, although they still have huge potential point outputs. Baero and Ongoing Destroyer seem more flexible at the moment and therefore harder to counter, even if they rarely put up 60 or 70 point totals at the end of a game. I expect this coming week to follow a similar path as players look to rack up some cubes. They should be following this established trend on the ladder. Once we get closer to the season end, we'll find a few more innovative concepts, we think, as players prepare for the road back to Infinite at the start of December. I look forward to keeping an eye out on how these things develop, and I will of course keep you posted in this series and other places like our live streams as they do so. Until then, I hope you have a great time snapping out there in the multiverse. If you want to comment on this tier list or discuss it with the team, feel free to join the community Discord server you find in the description box down below. Let us know what you think and come and have a chat with thousands of other Marvel Snap players. Alternatively, you can also just find us on Twitter over at Marvel Snap Zone and let us know what you think over there. But that is this week's tier list and every single deck we think worth talking about on it. I have been HowlingMines, you have been amazing. Don't forget to subscribe and I will see you again very soon for more things here at Marvel Snap Zone. Have a good one.